First, we broke the matrix. Now we're putting intercom in the cloud. Telos Infinity Virtual Intercom Platform, VIP, is the first fully featured cloud-based intercom system. With VIP, you get sophisticated comms virtually, making cloud-based media production workflows available on any device, smartphone, laptop, desktop, or tablet. You can even use third-party control devices like Elgato's Stream Deck to control Telos Infinity VIP. Now, you can have Telos Infinity IP Intercom's award-winning performance, scalability, ease of integration, and cost efficiencies anywhere, at home, on-prem, site-to-site, or in the cloud. Telos Infinity VIP is cost-efficient, less maintenance, infrastructure, and space required, scalable, pay for only what you need. Easy to use, virtual panels on familiar devices like smartphones, tablets, and PCs. Infinity VIP gives you reliable, proven cloud workflows in real time. And with VIP, you get flexible deployment options and Telos Care Plus for premium service and support. Deploy Infinity VIP to suit your workflow on premises by installing Infinity VIP on your own server hardware or out of the box with the Infinity VIP server appliance. Alternatively, choose cloud deployment in a private data center or hosted by popular public cloud services. No matter which deployment you choose, you get the same convenient user experience. Infinity VIP also works with Infinity hardware panels and belt packs. It integrates with any other third-party intercom or AOIP network using AES67 or SMPTE 2110-30. Telos Infinity VIP. Sophisticated comms, virtually.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Heather McLean, editor at SVG Europe. Firstly, a big thank you to our sponsors today, Telos Alliance and TSL. Thank you very much for helping support us. Today, we're going to be looking at whether audio in the cloud is lagging behind the development of video in cloud-based solutions. Industry leaders are embracing the technology to enable more flexible ways of producing live content, including remote and decentralized workflows. While video and audio are both being pushed over the cloud today, the former is definitely leading the way in terms of sophisticated solutions and uptake. I'm going to hand over now to our fantastic chair with a wonderful beard, Roger Charlesworth, to take this discussion forwards with our bevy of speakers. Hi, Roger.
Oh, great. Thanks, Heather. We're lucky to be joined today by Harry Brown and Alex Judd from Sky, Ian Fletcher from Grass Valley, Martin Deister from Telos, also Greg Shea from Telos, Mark Stevens from AWS, Tom Sahara here, a consultant advisor in the US, Tom Knowles from Solid State Logic, and let's see, who did I forget? I think that's it, right? Oh, so I think what we've talked about this in a lot of meetings before. We've had a lot of discussions about this, and what I think we see now is that this is really starting to move very fast, and it's almost happening because so many of these things happen sort of under NDAs or are being planned for. We don't even kind of get how fast it's really happening. So I think we're going to have a couple of technology updates and some discussion afterwards. But I think first, I think I want to throw it over to you, Mark, and talk about it from the outside. This looks like it's happening. It's moving pretty fast. And what does that look like from AWS's perspective?
Yeah. Hey, Roger. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, for sure. It was interesting. Just before this panel, I went in and talked to the rest of the M&E team and was asking them, how does this live production look different from, a year or two ago? And you're right, it is accelerating, right? Like I spent years with Grass Valley and that team kind of building their solution, but then you go out there and look in terms of audio mixing, now there's Sienna and Kiswi and Llama and Chiron and TVU. So you keep seeing more and more companies realizing that it's possible to do this in the cloud, and many are doing it. There's even an interesting blog on SVG Europe about ATP, AWS and Gravity Media and what they did with live production at the Paris Masters. And they took the first 4 days, brought in a bunch of vendors and said, hey, we're going to do a trial and let everyone kind of integrate their solutions and see what we can do live. So it was live video mixing, ingest, slow motion replay, multi-viewer audio mixing, and even NLE, right? You can run a GPU instance in the cloud, run Adobe Premiere, and get very quick turnaround for live production. So yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing. It's definitely accelerating.
It's interesting. It feels like it's reaching where it started sort of in the master control area. Now we're getting closer and closer to production.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's kind of expanding, all over, even from, what we see like live sports production. We also work with a lot of large studios and things now that are doing, production for all sorts of episodic and cinematic and things too. So it's production across the board has just really increased quite a bit, we've seen.
Yeah, great. Tom Sahara, you have anything to kind of add to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of productions have figured out that the technologies allowed people to basically stay where they are and really to utilize the best in class of people and facilities that you can now integrate into your productions. So it's really expanded the range of services that are available to people. It started out probably in the Olympic and esports worlds where just trying to travel so many people was just cost prohibitive. But the pandemic really accelerated that to where every production now looks at finding the best person that they need to be an analyst or a commentator, and in many cases, them being actually away from the production, commentating on the production from somewhere, wherever they are, and being able to lend their expertise. So that's really opened up a lot of opportunities for productions to raise the level of the quality of what they do, as well as get the expertise that they're after. So I think many producers have realized that this is a valuable tool for them, and it's no longer just something that they need to do to save money. It's now actually something that they can use to elevate the level of their production. And as Mark referred to, many studios now, through video walls and game engines, they're now doing live effects. So the green screens very soon will be something of the past, because you no longer have to sit in a green room. You can actually render photorealistic scenes right there with the talent and make them feel like they're actually immersed in that environment and not just living in a green room. So over the past 12, 18 months, it went from a pandemic solution to now a real means of producing quality programming. So I think that's why you see a lot of companies really leaping in and making the investments, because they see this as a new way of doing business, and it's not just a catch up to the pandemic solutions. So it's really exciting because it is moving very fast.
Well, and it feels like the pandemic was a real accelerator here, that it allowed people to try things that they
it forced people to change. So yeah. I think that's really what the trigger was, is you could not function in the traditional manner. You had to come up with a new solution, and that really was, I think, what pulled the covers off all this technology and capability, was just being forced to do it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just talk about. I think the important thing here, as Mark, as you've said, is that this is growing, and it's moving closer toward production. And I guess it feels, as Heather mentioned in her opening remarks, it feels like audio has had to catch up. And I don't know quite what the, I don't know quite what the reasons are for that. Audio kind of lives as its own discipline. And I think sometimes the production is so concerned with pictures that if there's audio, some kind of audio there, they're good with it. And in the same way, audio people sometimes live in their own world. Ian, I guess I wanted to just start with you. Your kind of progression of what capabilities went into AMP and what kind of audio capabilities, that kind of evolved very quickly.
Yeah,
is that
I mean,
fair to say?
Yes, exactly. And I think, as we were just discussing, it very much driven by the pandemic. The transition was happening, but it was absolutely an accelerant. And it also really caused broadcasters to slay all the remaining sacred cows, really, because, we've all been told for years that, television special, broadcast special, and when I'm old enough to remember the days before computers were used at all in transmission chains. And, as one of the early promoters of software-based playout systems, I was told, oh, we'll never use a computer on a primetime TV to play out channels. And nowadays that's just, virtually everybody does it. But it was always about latency. We measured latency in lines, not frames. Audio had to be absolutely very, very, same low latency. Everything had to be uncompressed. And even major networks have been forced to abandon that in order to stay on the air during the pandemic. And yes, whilst in some cases they're now moving back and still using high-end traditional systems where it absolutely makes sense. I mean, nobody's switching the Super Bowl in the cloud anytime soon. It's going to be a huge big Grass Valley switcher in a truck for an awful long time. But they've also realized that a lot of those things that they were hanging on to, actually they can afford to relax. It doesn't have to be, everything doesn't have to be uncompressed. People are using NDI a lot in the cloud, and nobody ever thought that would happen. Latency, people are accepting that when you're in the cloud, there's going to be a bit more latency. As long as you can get that latency down to human acceptable limits and not be obsessed with, well, is it so many milliseconds? It's more about, what does it feel like to the user? Can the user do their job? Can I make a production decision by looking at a low latency multi-viewer and punching a button on a switcher? If I'm an audio person, can I move a fader on a MIDI panel and have it control an audio mixer in the cloud and hear the results of that fast enough for me to do my job? That's what actually matters. And yes,
well, and
you're right.
often, Ian, we care about, I'll interrupt you, we care about synchronicity is what we really need, not necessarily low latency we need to see the picture and affect what's going on at the same time.
Yeah, it's what we call the production loop is the important bit about the latency. How long it takes to get signals from a location to the cloud and how long it takes to get from the cloud to the home, they're less important than what's that tight loop between the production team and what they're interacting with. But yes, we were forced to sort of accelerate a lot of our development. Early adopters were esports. But even in those use cases, which are relatively simple switching use cases, audio starts to get important pretty quickly when you've got casters, you've got game effects, you've got music beds. So very quickly, our kind of basic audio mixing, which was built into our master control product, which was basically just gain adjust, we very quickly had to accelerate to a completely separate, broken out audio mixer solution with sort of EQ and compression and delay and these kind of basic things you would expect. But the challenge we've always had is because we make life difficult for ourselves by sticking to the kind of pure cloud mantra. So no lift and shift, no remote desktop, it's all pure cloud, and all the user interfaces are HTML, multi-user, so you could have different users in different parts of the world interacting with the same production. That challenges even simple things like, how do I get audio metering back to a user interface that's running in a web browser fast enough to be useful? So we've really spent a lot of time kind of solving some of those problems, so to enable broadcasters to blur the line between what used to be called master control and what now is effectively mini productions. And we're seeing that line is getting very blurred. And a lot of our use cases are kind of pop-up production control rooms for reformatting sports events, adding foreign languages, remixing, repackaging for different markets, which still need quite a lot of audio manipulation as part of that work.
Well, as that gets closer to production and scales up, I mean, you spun up some pretty sophisticated audio solutions when you realized you had to, and really the audio features of the standalone system is really pretty powerful and has some great features, some great smarts to it. But as we get closer to production, do you think that those solutions will scale, or do we need really an order of magnitude more powerful solutions, and are those better developed by third parties?
Well, we welcome partnerships anyway, and several my colleagues on this call we talk to regularly. So I think there's two parts to your question. There's scale horizontally and there's depth as well. So scaling outwards doesn't really bother me. We've already tested in the sort of 60, high 64 kind of channel counts with 32 separate outputs on a reasonable sized AWS machine, allowing for the fact that we want to use the same machine to do lots of stuff as well, like video production, because we try and avoid separating things onto different compute nodes, because then you have to kind of reassemble everything. So our audio mixer has to be low enough to deal with the fact that lots of vision processing is happening on the same box. But then there's the issue of, well, what's the most efficient way of getting large amounts of audio feeds into the cloud? You know, and there's, at the moment, the best method for us seems to be just embedding it on a video stream and sticking, you know, 8 pairs on each stream from a remote location. But then there's scale in terms of the other way, depth, feature set. And I think there it's less about the computational capabilities of a computer, because audio processing at the end of the day is just largely maths. It all comes down to how far does Grass Valley as a company want to go down that line by ourselves, and where do we want to, you know, partner with people who've got specialist algorithms for doing things like auto mixing and those kind of things. But also it comes down to the control surface. I think that's going to be one of the limiting factors. Our stuff can be driven off a soft screen, but also most people obviously use a MIDI panel, but then a MIDI panel isn't going to let you expose all of the sophisticated features that you could have on a professional high-end mixing console. So I think that's going to be the next problem to solve. You know, how do you link sort of more sort of large scale, high-end control surfaces with effectively software processing running in the cloud?
Well, and that's one of the subjects we kind of picked for discussion a little bit later, but it's a great, great point. When we get to real-time mixing of an actual production, then suddenly you need more than just a MIDI fader pack, I think.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Maybe I'll just throw to you, Greg, talk a little bit about the evolution of what you guys have been doing with mixing at Telos. And I guess, you kind of came at this originally from a radio perspective, that
Yes.
Virtualization is something that you've done for a long time.
Yes,
And,
I have to smile at the characterization of audio catching up to video. Of course, in radio, it's all audio. And as Ian just mentioned, the key thing is enabling the workflow, enabling the live show to go on, and finding a way to do that. I'd like to point out, if I may share my screen, we talk about, let's see. Okay, provided that shows up. Is that showing?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So this is just is very brief. This shows, from our view of the world, the breadth of our product line for getting a live audio show on the air, from ingest through to mixing and all the various things you have to do. The talk show system is in here. intercom coordination all the way out to streaming or broadcast to the tower. So this represents, and I have to switch my, here we go. Our current products, which are deliverable as software, and we right now have a mix of virtual machine, but also containers, and our focus is on containers, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In the very near horizon are these products as well, and long term, it's everything. So, you know, our goal is to get the entire broadcast audio chain able to be virtualized. Now, notice I'm saying I'm choosing my words carefully because one of the distinctions I want to make is when we talk about cloud, cloud is a place to run your virtualized software, but there is a dimension when you may want to run some of it on premises. And of course, the difference is the latency. You're always going to have the round trip latencies larger. And it was touched on before in terms of what is the latency that allows you to do a live show. The lowest latency is hearing yourself in your own ear. And it's fair to say you're never going to be able to do that in the cloud because the time of flight is just too long. So there's always going to be a little bit of mixing back in your own ear. You can do the mix minus in the cloud and bring back and then add yourself in. There's a level of latency to have an effective real-time conversation with people remotely. We're doing that right now. That's pretty well handled. And as mentioned, you know, you need your control latencies to be low enough so that you can effectively control things and not think the equipment is broke. So when we say cloud, we're really talking about delivering the functionality of the products in software that are able to be run where appropriate. So really the economic change is taking advantage of server software and getting away from, you know, bespoke hardware appliances. Then you can leverage where it's appropriate and effective and economic to run those software products.
Yeah.
And I will mention, because I know you're going to ask me, it's come up. For instance, what kinds of interfaces? Okay, so
Yeah.
we use the interfaces that make sense. So for instance, for NDI, we have implementations of NDI. We're running them with real live customers. And we do plan to bring this out where it makes sense. You know, people can say, well, you know, here's these, you know, industry standards, you know, SMPTE and AES and all this, and here's NDI. But the fact is, you make the connections where it makes sense, where the customer products on the other side have. So if we're going to go into a supply audio processing in a facility that they're using NDI, then NDI is the way that you connect. It's a very practical thing. It's also, we've found NDI to be cloud friendly. It's unicast, and we found it to work effectively.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of become a de facto standard. So you're saying that, and that really applies, the places where you'd like to use NDI are not just for a mixer, but for other types of endpoints.
Well, one of the fine distinctions is, for instance, let's say on premises, you were traditionally Axia, you know, we do the mixing in software over the network to your own ear, very low latency. Our live streams allow you to have your voice in your ear less than 3 milliseconds. That probably is hard to achieve with some of these other protocols. Whereas, you know, some live wire low latency is specifically designed for low latency. So again, you have to match the interface and the protocol to what the workflow is, what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you make that point. So that about the, you know, self-hearing and stuff like that, that in the traditional radio, a lot of your network products already have distributed processing, or an IO box has processing So it may be at a remote endpoint, but part of the mixing load for self-hear and stuff is pushed off to that endpoint so that it's low latency.
Right.
Yeah. So what's happening with, can you talk a little bit about mixer functions in the cloud and what's the sort of state of progress there? Or
well, we have yes, we have a released products. We have live on air running now. I'll say again, it's the product as we deliver in an OCI compliant container, commonly called a Docker container, and it's kind of up to the customer's choice. Are they going to run it in the cloud? And we do have customers doing that, and or possibly on premises, and we have customers doing that. And it often comes down to, an economic thing. If they're going to be live 24/7, 365, they have to do the math. Is it something they own the server room, or do they hire out to one of the cloud providers? So. In terms of features, what we find, what we end up delivering is the knowledge and the expertise of the workflow. So for instance, the difference between somebody might try to run a virtual machine and a digital audio workstation, remotely, but that's not the same as a broadcast mixer with all the features and the mix minuses and all the talkbacks and all the things that make a show flow. So. It's not just the technology, of course, it's also having the right features.
Yeah, interesting. Well, that's great. I think Tim Cuthbertson, are you on here, Tim? Did we lose him? I guess we did lose him. Okay, there you go. Good deal. Well, then I think maybe we'll jump to you, Alex and Harry. I think I'm curious how this is something that virtualized production is something which, as Tom said, was greatly accelerated by the pandemic. And you're really starting to leverage virtualized production in different ways and beginning to leverage the cloud. And I wonder if you guys could share your journey a little bit, Alex.
Yeah. So, hi. Yeah. So I mean, kind of in terms of our journey, I feel like things have kind of developed quite significantly from kind of where we were kind of last year. I would say there's kind of been some kind of developments in kind of like our approach to workflows and how we kind of manage systems really, as kind of people have got more au fait with kind of how things actually kind of work within the kind of architecture of what we're doing. We've done it kind of several times for different productions where we've repeated kind of what has gone well and kind of tested and experimented in order to kind of develop different ways of working with the systems. I mean, in terms of kind of how we work, we kind of spin up a different kind of VPC for every kind of different production. So we kind of tailor that as per kind of the specific kind of requirements for that production. And I think kind of with that, there are certain considerations that I think we've kind of touched on previously, which are kind of the architecture of how you put things together within like a public cloud, or whether it's in a data center, for instance, versus kind of different issues that you might be presented around security, and how you might have to architect things to actually kind of bring in remote contributors. So there are kind of different considerations that maybe you kind of come up against in kind of how you think about building these things, because you have to kind of consider like different stages how you're going to actually bring people into the productions. So I say, sorry, go ahead. You're going to ask the question.
No, go ahead. No.
I think yeah, some of the kind of things that we've been looking at and experimenting with, I think have kind of enabled us to kind of make it easier to be able to bring audio in and out of the cloud. Obviously, the way that we're kind of working, we're in public cloud, so there are kind of certain challenges with that, which you have to kind of overcome.
And are you using things like NDI to bring audio into the cloud?
So yeah, we've been using NDI, and I think kind of there are benefits with that, but there's also some kind of parts to that we're working on. Kind of we've found a couple of things that we've kind of asked for improvements with.
Well, and this is the thing. I mean, we've talked about this in terms of virtualized production in general. It's even when you're getting them through traditional transmission lines and you're getting them 16 at a time, you kind of, it's a pain in the ass to go find everything. If you've got everything shoved into an SDI and you've got 100 microphones or something.
I think that's the thing when you start to think about scalability, and when you start to think about kind of how this kind of whole piece works as a whole, like a you know, as a larger thing, how does that actually work? And I think part of the kind of challenges we've kind of been kind of hurdling through or going over are really kind of how do you integrate as well with kind of current technologies, because you may not kind of always be in a situation where you're completely cloud agnostic. We've kind of designed things to be in a cloud agnostic way, but there might be certain scenarios where you need, you know, you've got touch points that are kind of integrated with your on-premise systems. And I think there are interesting kind of things that are happening around that, where I kind of see that the importance of on-prem systems and kind of the virtualized systems kind of almost need to seamlessly kind of work together in a way where it's kind of, you know, you might have like a hybrid kind of model almost, really, in terms of your operation for certain aspects. And that's not, I think that's like not something that kind of applies to everyone, but I do think that when you look at the kind of opportunity and growth that could come out of this and is coming out of this, I think that that piece of it is kind of partly key, I think, to a hybrid model.
Well, does the hybrid model need everything to move? Does it need a sort of parallelism of
almost
everything?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the other question too is, you know, we'll come back to this, and I want to get you guys' take on this too, but is when we get to sort of full scale productions, can we do audio in the cloud where we've got hundreds, if not 1,000 channels, and, you know, what kind of control surface and things like that do we see, even though that cloud may then need to be then connected to a control room? Does it make more sense for the resource, the mixing engine, to live in the cloud, and for the rest of production live in the cloud, but maybe needs to be you need more facility around it for the UI?
I think that's a really important point. I mean, one of the things about the cloud we always have to remind ourselves is just because something is possible doesn't mean it always makes sense. And I think, you know, that's a good example. If you've got 500 microphones and you need you're going to want a big physical service to mix them, and you've got low latency concerns, does it really make sense to try and shift all of that to the cloud to then, you know, control it on the ground? And my answer to that would probably be no. And so,
yeah, unless it's starting in the cloud.
Exactly. That's the difference. But I mean, if you think of a traditional sports event on a truck where, you know, you've got all the feeds there, then why wouldn't you do it there? What you might be doing is then integrating that, the video and the audio that's being done in the truck into a cloud-based production, combining other elements. And so then being able to keep that synchronization and understand the latencies and the impacts of those then gets important.
I think that's something kind of Harry's kind of been dealing with on a kind of daily basis, to be honest with you. So maybe Harry wants to pick up on kind of how the kind of what the challenges are and the operational kind of aspects of that, because I think there's definitely a desired end game here, I think, really out of this.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about a production at Sky and I guess relate that to the bigger picture. Last year we used our cloud gallery to cover COP26 with a pop-up channel on Sky, and it was also streamed to YouTube. And at this event, most of the world leaders gathered to discuss the impact of climate change on our environment. And I thought it was quite fitting that through the use of a cloud gallery to cover this event, we negated the need for an OB truck and gallery crew to, drive up to Scotland to cover that. And our coverage at COP26 is a great example of why in certain scenarios, cloud productions are the way forward. By now, we all know the benefits of cloud workflows, but I just wanted to reiterate why moving in this direction is so exciting. As Alex mentioned, for us, COP26 was a hybrid of cloud and on-prem technology. We used our comm system at Sky, and we had to plan to integrate the cloud into this, which was fun. We used some IP software codecs to get our pre-hears and clean feeds out of the cloud into our comm system, then created IFBs which were sent out. We had contributions from all over the world for this event. But MCR managed those into the cloud for us. It being cloud software or cloud software system means that it's alien to most operators. So the operation needed to be accessible and user-friendly to our operators as much as possible. So we gave them a 16 fader controller and a MIDI pad for grams, and simplified useful features into shortcuts, such as audio routing they could just do at a touch of a button. And at this point, I think Ian mentioned, I know I would probably get into the discussion on MIDI later, but Ian mentioned that he was talking about MIDI panel over, like a touch screen. And, I think we need to maybe look at like the MIDI languages that we're using at Sky to get the most out of our sound desk that we're using, because at the moment it is quite limiting. We can't just very easily assign a button to control a parameter at this stage, so we need to do some more research into that. The original question was about planning with Alex, but one of the benefits of it being in a virtual environment, the cloud, means that we can easily automate actions, such as we had one scenario where we had two feeds going out, one to our main channel and the other to YouTube, and one was with adverts and one was just with music instead. And instead of we found out this quite late in the day, but instead of having music just on, say, tracks 3 and 4 of the adverts, and just send them out like that, we were able to just configure a MIDI trigger from the audio being received into the mixer, and get that to send a message to our grams player to trigger the grams, and then when we faded up the bumper, it would send a trigger to the grams player to stop. So yeah, the original question was about planning with Alex, but the fact of the matter is that due to the versatility of DAWs, issues can come out of the blue and can be solved like pretty quickly with a handy plugin or a bit of code, meaning that some of the operations we've tackled well quickly without them being presented in an initial plan. I'll quickly touch on the issue of sync and latency. I know it's been visited quite a lot, but with sync, amazingly, due to the form of audio transport we're using and the route that it takes, video was leading. Heather mentioned right at the top that cloud audio workflows are lagging behind video, but in this case, it's literally is behind. So we had to delay the video further downstream from us, which is an issue we haven't really seen before cloud. Latency, we've managed to seriously reduce our latency time, but currently obviously nowhere near to zero latency, the kind you need for a reporter to hear themselves back in a noisy stadium. Because of this, we've started thinking about how we can create like a local queue program mix for the reporter on site. Or even now, we have to think about how we create that in a studio, because even if you are on site right next to the studio, the audio still goes up to the cloud and back down. So you have to treat that like an outside broadcast as well. And currently we have lots of pieces of software kind of cobbled together to achieve these things, but we're hoping to slim that down. Door-wise at Sky, it's no secret that we're still using Reaper. By now, most people here have moved on. It's not a broadcast console, but the extreme flexibility of the door means we're reluctant to let it go yet, but we're keen to find a suitable replacement. But I guess I'll elaborate on what we've seen so far. Scalability, I mean, it's been said lots before, but I'll say it again. I guess we see our limits as the CPU power of the cloud instance, as opposed to, you know, the DSP of the software. If one of the beauties of cloud workflows is the seemingly limitless connectivity and scalability of cloud models, the audio desk should be the same.
Right. Well, I think that's a point too. And, you know, Mark, you can weigh in on this, but often if, to Ian's point earlier, if the connectivity is already in the cloud, and that's what's happening, certainly here a lot is AWS may be providing the connectivity. So the cloud may be the closest place to the network backbone. Does that kind of make sense?
I was listening to right, like you know, Harry talk, and then also Greg, and you know, the one thing we are continually trying to do is innovate on behalf of like these partners and customers. And so, you know, something like reducing latency, right? We also have something called wavelength, and I don't know if some of these the companies here have looked at this, but where we're embedding hardware into the like mobile data center to kind of reduce latency. And so that means whether you're using, you know, 3ds Max and Maya and Nuke and all these sort of applications like audio that need super low latency, like you're in a very close data center that then goes over our backbone for lower latency networking. So yeah, those are the other kinds of things we're trying to do to continually innovate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Harry, if you don't mind, I think we'll leave it there now. I wanted to just check in a little bit with Gary from Harrison. You guys have built giant film consoles that all use general purpose Intel servers. And you've also made a small virtualized, sort of, I would say, a music mixing console that can run in the cloud or runs in the cloud. So Gary, you guys had kind of a huge head start with this, and you've looked at sort of how do you utilize some of the assets you already have to address this. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that evolution and where we are now, and you know, where in terms of control surfaces, where you think the solutions are.
Well, I think in terms of control surfaces, there's a lot of options right now, and we have a little bit of an alliance going on with Icon. It's the company from Hong Kong. They make some really nice smaller control surfaces. Of course, we make big console control surfaces. What we're doing right now is we kind of backtracked. You know, you mentioned those big post-production consoles we made, and they technically are cloud-based signal processing, but they weren't made for broadcast. And you know, there's a lot of detail work that has to go on. So we kind of backtracked with Tim and ASG. We started this BBM thing, and kind of started at the very beginning of a more of a basic harnessing a little bit of that power to do a broadcast thing. And now, you know, the goal is to move forward and to be able to provide ultimately that large format audio console in the cloud. And that's what we're doing. It's not an easy process, and it's not a fast process, but it's in process. So along with that comes all these different stages. We have a small cloud-based mixer right now. You can hook up a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 Icon controllers to it. You can actually build a pretty nice system. The back end isn't as wide open and flexible as Reaper, for example. We didn't do that. We kind of harnessed it and made some things very specific for some very specific broadcast functionality, and we continue to add things to that as we move along here. And ultimately, it will end up being a large format audio console where the back end runs in the cloud and with a nice big A1 control surface, and that's the goal. And we're headed toward that. Unfortunately, it's not a fast process. We have to go through the whole process because it's a difficult one.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, but you had a big head start in terms of
we've been
surrounding technologies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've been doing the signal processing and that type of thing for 14, 15 years now. So it's not a new thing. It's now we got to figure out how to really tailor that to the broadcast markets. And working with Alex and these guys, we're getting a lot of feedback, which is great. And it's very new right now. I mean, everybody's trying to figure out what to do and where to go. So we're kind of parceling all that information and building a roadmap to get there.
And do you see doing very large scale mixing engines? Do you see that as part of that roadmap? Is that going to be a market that's worth addressing? And
I think it is. It traditionally has been for console manufacturers over the years. People want a large format console, and the demand is there. So yeah, I think it's absolutely the goal, and it can be done. We've been building large processing systems running on host-based technology for a long time. So technically, there's no reason why not to do it. You have to do it. The bigger problem for us is making all the broadcast specific things. A broadcast console is much different than a large post-production console. So there's a lot of details there that we gotta filter through. The technical part of it actually is not difficult. It's making it do the things that the customers need them to do in the way that they need them to do them, and that's tricky. So that feedback comes at us all the time as we start deploying the smaller versions of this, and we start growing this thing up. So it's an ongoing process.
Well, there you go. Well, I think Tim, if you're available, what's your overview? You guys began, ASG began doing this stuff very early in the pandemic of sort of integrating production solutions for some of your corporate clients, and you saw identified audio as an area where the solutions needed to improve. You began using Reaper. Kind of where do you see this now? And you're also sort of in discussions with lots of people about stuff I'm sure you can't talk about, but the types of projects that you're looking at, that these are getting more and more sophisticated, and the audio solutions that they require and that you anticipate are probably getting more sophisticated. Can you talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. You're right. ASG started, it's probably almost 2 years ago now. And it just, it was prior to the pandemic or pre-pandemic. And it was partly because of our relationship with Google on a number of other fronts, or Google Productions, that it was like, well, why is Google working on-prem when they have this wonderful cloud that's sort of in-house, And we started early on looking at how to push internal, if you want to call it, enterprise production or in-house productions into Google's cloud for Google themselves. And the pandemic, of course, accelerated that and really took it outside into the kind of market as a whole, or took our pushed our attention out into the market as a whole. And we've moved on now in 2 years from what I would call basic sort of science experiment, from with rubber bands and bits of string and wrappers around wrappers that sort of hopefully translated and talked to other pieces of the system, to what is really now considerably more sophisticated than it was 12 months ago or even 6 months ago. And the interesting part about it, really, I think from a market perspective, is we don't have a single client now that doesn't consider moving to cloud in some sense or another. Whether they actually do, and whether there's a balance. Then there's a balance between what's done on-prem and what's done in cloud. It's top of mind. It's top of conversation, and it's gone to that point now because we have flexibility in a cloud environment where, from a business perspective, it makes sense. From a financial perspective, it makes sense because much of it moves to OpEx budget or to subscription costs. From a staffing flexibility standpoint, it makes sense. From a support standpoint, it makes sense because there can be centralization of resources. There can be centralization of subject matter experts that know how to do this. And as a consequence, we started out looking at sort of single station type projects or single cloud type projects, and it's now much more mainstream, with it being pushed into the news and sports markets. There clearly are issues, but I think the big shift now is there's an expectation that what we did before in an on-premise environment, when we built a station and we built a central equipment room, and we had production control rooms with racks and racks and racks of gear, is that can be fully replicated in cloud. And manufacturers broadly, and ASG obviously, we're a systems integrator and a VAR, so we deal with the entire kind of gamut of manufacturers supplying all sorts of broadcast equipment. Manufacturers are now really focused, and in some cases, providing not so much the lift and shift where we started out 2 years ago of, we can push this hybrid product into the cloud. It's now dedicated. Grass Valley, as Ian was saying earlier, this is product that is cloud designed, it's cloud specific. Yes, it could run in hybrid environments, and does run in hybrid environments, but really it's just been designed for this cloud broadcast transition that's occurring. So where we're at now is companies such as Harrison, and we were just discussing that those products are 100% focused on doing it right in the cloud, not necessarily in the same way that it would have been done on-prem historically, and that's exciting too. But the drive is, how do we make this more sophisticated? We're now talking about how the audio integrates in the automation systems. We're talking about balancing the on-prem requirements in a hybrid environment, because we still have to have studios with cameras and audio, and people talking and people being interviewed, and reporters filing stories. So how do we integrate, or how do we best integrate what needs to stay on-prem potentially, or what signals can stay on-prem, can stay in the local environment, and what signals have to go to cloud? And that again is driven by number one, the needs of latency and the transport. Number two, really the analysis of how does this broadcast model run or work as we move forward and become sort of templated, so it can move on from station to station to station to station. So we're at that point now where it's gained a degree of maturity. It's gained, we know we can do it. It has the flexibility that broadcasters like and require. And there really isn't anything that, as was cited earlier, there isn't anything that's a technical obstacle. It's a question of, let's just get the products, let's get the integration, let's get the sophistication into the system that is required to produce, if you like, a carbon copy of what we would have done from a broadcast perspective on-prem.
Well, and what you're kind of talking about, Tim, is purposely, and it's interesting how you phrase this, but sort of purposely deliberately building something in the cloud rather than building it physically. And integrating in the cloud has become sort of something you guys do, just like you would integrate with racks and cables, that it may be a conscious decision to build it in the cloud because it's a better way to build it, easier, faster. And I got to think about things like sports networks and, as you say, stations, terrestrial stations here in the States, where you're trying to scale quickly, and sort of that being able to build something without having to build a building to put it in is also sort of probably relevant.
Well, the buildings that you build now need not be the same as the buildings were before. There isn't the same capital investment in those structures or in those buildings. And from a flexibility standpoint, the way that this is architecting, or the way that it's working, is this is built as sort of Lego blocks or Lego bricks. And I don't know if when you started as a kid with Lego, you started with that kind of gray, large, flat plastic base that you then plug things on. So the base is there and the bricks are there. And, because we can drive this stuff with scripts and, Terraform code in the cloud, it's very, very easy to spin up something pretty quickly. It still needs its interface into, into the studio, the studio proper, but the possibilities of bringing up different types of production control environment, the possibilities of adapting on a almost hourly basis. It could be on an hourly basis. No one's really doing that or thinking about it in that way, but you could have an environment that does the morning news that is different from the afternoon shows, and without great change in the overall infrastructure that's provided. It's just a question of focus. Well, we're doing this program, we'll change it to do this. In the same way that you have automation or orchestration that does that in the station right now. And that sophistication is certainly available. It's a question of how quickly it's adopted, and how quickly in some senses, it's a human resource issue. We're having to train people and educate people on how this runs when you haven't got a central equipment room to walk into and see all the lights flashing.
Point to stuff.
It's virtual and it's abstracted, and as such, you have to think about things differently. In the same way that we had to think about things differently when we went to 2110 from SDI.
Sure.
It's just, it's a different environment, it's a different transport, and it's a transition forward. The challenge, sorry, I was there. The challenges as we move forward in audio are scaling out, which Harrison was just talking about, Gary was just talking about, and also at this point in time, everything that we've done has been stereo. We've been two channels, and all the kind of issues around stereo stuff is they're fine, they're solved in one way or another. you move to 5.1 or even, you know, an immersive audio, that's another step that has to be taken, because there's, again, a greater degree of sophistication required to do that as well.
Oh, I want to pick up that in a separate discussion, but you know, there's this kind of good enough for rock and roll. It seems like we went through the same thing with streaming, was like, oh, well, you know, just give them that mobile profile, that's good enough. You know, stereo is good enough. But let's come back to that. I want to leave it there, Tim, for a minute.
Thank you.
And just pivot a little bit and talk about intercom in the cloud. And I know, Martin, you guys were sort of got out very early on IP, distributed IP intercom systems.
Yep.
That were standards based and IP, literally IP based. And it's kind of early in moving in that direction. And in fact, I suppose Telos has a history of supplying network intercom that's IP based. So what you really did was expanded on what Telos was already doing.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
you very
true.
quickly, within the last 2 years, kind of pivoted to virtualizing that same system in the cloud.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering kind of where you are in that journey and what's happening with deployments, and you know, where are we with that?
So Infinity VIP is a product that's shipping now. We have people using it within environments like Grass Valley AMP. Some people may have seen we're a partner of AMP, so you can deploy an Infinity system within that architecture. So we have people using it on that. We've got customers around the world now using it as part of their day-to-day workflow in news and in a few other applications. So it's you know, it took us a while to get there. It's that old adage of 90% of the project taking 10% of the time, and the other 10% taking the 90%. And these are all the lessons that we learned about the language of virtualizing a product and then deploying it in the cloud. Really, it's all those issues around security and talking to the many customers that I've spoken to over the last 18 months or so, and all the different variations on a theme of how they want to work. You know, whether this is going to be public cloud, whether any elements can be public facing, whether everything has to be behind a DMZ and wrapped up nice and tight so nothing can touch the outside world. You know, everybody that's spoken about various aspects of cloud on this call so far has at one time or another used the word hybrid to describe a working environment where some elements are in the cloud and some of them are on premise, and your systems join together. And that's never truer than it is with an intercom system. You know, and we've had to learn about that, because ultimately what we've built is a virtualized intercom system that's agile enough to be deployed anywhere. So, you know, I could send everybody right now an intercom panel, and we could continue this meeting on comms. You know, you have a panel in front of you, and we put everyone in a PL, and we could carry on. But ultimately, it has to look and feel and behave like a comm system. The basic architecture is the same. Some people will want panels. There'll be a whole bunch of 4 wires coming to and from different places. Talent needs an earpiece. Camera operators need a headset that can communicate with the control room, and all of those things, you know, are wrapped up in the comm system. So we've had to figure out, how does that work in an environment? Is it all in cloud? Is some of it on-prem? How do you join the bits together? What are the component parts that you need to do that? NDI's come into the mix recently as a media transport mechanism that's not just for video, and so NDI is something that's going to roll out into Infinity in the very near future. We started using Opus for interconnectivity for 4 wires, and indeed Opus is what works within AMP as our 4-wire connectivity between Ian's fabulous audio mixer and the intercom system. So it's been a really interesting 18 months in terms of sucking in all these ideas and all this information, then churning it around and turning it into a product which we're proud to say is out there and being used.
Well, it feels from here like you guys have moved pretty fast to sort of to take advantage of some of these opportunities.
Yeah, also, absolutely. Yeah.
It's sort of, you're halfway there, I guess, too, just because
I'd like to think we're halfway there, but I think
you know,
well, something always comes up and bites you. You know, the latest iOS release, for example, screwed WebRTC for everybody that uses WebRTC. And if you're going to use a VIP panel on a phone, on an Apple, you're using WebRTC as a connectivity mechanism. And we're not the only people using WebRTC for media, but if you are and you're using an Apple device, then yeah, we had to do a lot of work to be able to fix that, because Apple aren't going to listen to us. So you know, it's things like that, and it's not just that. You know, it's some of the mechanisms that we were using in the early days require connection to the internet to be able to establish a secure connection, quote unquote secure, to give somebody a panel, and there are plenty of people that we've spoken to. So I can't have that. You know, I can't have your system that I'm going to buy talking to something that's outside of my control in order to make a connection. So you know, these are all lessons that we've learned over the 18 months or so, and things that we've had to adapt to, and we are adapting to. So it's certainly not been easy, but yeah, I think we're probably halfway along.
Right. Well, that's great. That's fantastic. Ian, you guys have probably run into this a lot as you sort of talk about these solutions. What about security? And there's a lot of best practice in network engineering over things like Martin just mentioned, but how do you see the security?
So
issue?
The elephant in the room really is we're talking a lot about signal formats and how we exchange data and these kinds of things, but if you buy into the cloud story properly, you have to build an entire ecosystem that requires huge amounts of knowledge that we've had to learn, and we've had to hire lots of new people, and we've been working on it a long time, and we've worked closely with AWS on some of this thing. So I think one of the things we've got to be careful of is that we don't lose sight of actually that's the next big problem as an industry we've got to solve, because we want to encourage lots of specialist vendors in this industry to carry on doing what they're good at. You know, audio is a great example. You have all these specialist companies who know phenomenal amount about audio, way more than Grass Valley do and I do. But to suddenly expect them to know how to build a cloud scale, highly secure, high availability cloud platform that they can deliver securely and exchange API keys and secure connections with other vendors. That's a lot to learn quickly and get it right. And you know, we're so used to, as an industry, and working in our little closed environment, firewalled from the outside world, and using, in the old days, serial connections and MIDI and REST APIs that are totally open and unsecured. Well, none of all that goes out of the window. And you know, how do users log on? What's their access control? So one of the things Grass Valley is very keen to do is to kind of share our the baseboard of the Lego, to stick with Tim's analogy, so that other vendors can build the Lego bricks and just drop them onto our Lego board, on our grey board, so they don't necessarily have to go and build an entire ecosystem and learn
so
how
you're
to
able to wrap that in the sort of best practices for security. And
exactly, and that's what we did with Martin on that project, and I think we learned a lot doing that, because that's not a trivial thing to do either, to sort of say to other vendors, here's our SDK, here's our security model, here's how to interface to us, and these are all the secure REST endpoints you need to call. So we need to,
so there's a role for collaboration and sort of opening the kimono more than maybe people would want to on the rising tide lifts.
But at a different level, at that control level, is almost more important than, I mean, exchanging frames of audio with each other is almost the easy bit. Whether it be Opus, whether it be NDI, that's the easy bit. But to do this properly and to be able to deliver a completely integrated solution to customers like Sky, who can then pick and choose the right Lego block to use, we've got to, as an industry, collaborate at that control and management layer.
I think,
yeah.
So I was just going to say, I think that the whole kind of like point around kind of making this accessible is absolutely key. I mean, I just kind of think, yeah, we've got a huge team around us who can help with all of this, but to kind of make it more accessible for kind of other, other broadcasters or kind of users to actually be able to do this. It's a massive point to be able to do that, and to actually be able to kind of hand it over in a state where it's kind of it's not a barrier to market, basically.
No.
I'd like to speak just briefly, Roger, to that.
Sure.
I think Ian is right. This is, security is really the big challenge. ASG has spent, I say we spend 50% of our time in at least half our time in managing security in these environments, and there's no consistency in the sense of everybody does it the same way. Each major broadcaster has their own approach to security and their own set of rules that you have to apply to, and it is having been bitten by it, it's incredibly complicated, or potentially incredibly complicated, and we all know why that we need security. That's quite obvious, but the way there's no sort of standard security methodology that you can take from one particular client to another client, and it's really interesting in terms of how different companies deal with it. It really isn't easy at all.
Well, and that's not necessarily
hours and hours of work in it.
Tim, that's not necessarily even out of best practice either. It may be more out of paranoia, or the security policies are not necessarily well formed or smart from a networking perspective. They can be arbitrary.
Yeah,
I'm not going to say your clients aren't smart. I'm just saying.
Oh, I think the clients. Yeah, it also depends. There's a lot of it's historic. It's like, how was security implemented 10 years ago, and is that relevant to today? And is it relevant? I mean, when those security policies were put in place, or that governance was put in place, in many cases, it wasn't because we were building production control rooms in the cloud. It was to cover. It was to cover, protection.
Getting your email or something.
Yeah,
or looking at your quarterly report.
Yeah. Or if you're a large corporation, say like Verizon or something like that, you were worried about everyone's cell phone records, in some portion of their networks, or everyone's data, or in fact their AOL email accounts. If we want to go back to the beginning of it all.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we have to build a production control room in this environment and meet those criteria. It's very interesting and quite challenging on some level.
And I think part of that kind of also means that, in certain instances, you might kind of be, have to go down a specific path to kind of actually be able to kind of meet the needs of like the security over kind of maybe the use case of the kit that you go, ideally wanted to use. So there are kind of things like that where this is like a huge consideration, really.
Yeah, and that's assuming your IT police is flexible enough to allow you to do that, which is another challenge in its own right. You have to be able to have a dialogue that's
the answer usually with the IT guys I deal with is no.
Yeah, yeah.
Can we do this?
We've all been there. I think the other factor is that broadcasters have got to understand that this is not like buying a piece of hardware or even a piece of software as we used to sell a few years ago, where you install it and you don't touch it for 2 years. If you're going to leverage as much of the web stack as you kind of need to in order to be agile and work effectively in these kind of environments, then software has to move quickly. It has to be updated regularly, often just for security reasons, because if you're sitting on the stack, the web stack, you have to kind of pay a tax as a development team. And Martin mentioned a great example with the WebRTC break. Chrome will update something and break something on, and we have to keep moving. And if you don't keep up to date with all the third-party dependencies that the web stack inevitably brings into your products, then you risk, leaving security holes. And so that means we have to keep pushing our code out and refreshing our code and checking for security dependencies that we have to upgrade to. But that also means the broadcasters and the users have to understand that if they want to be fully secure, they've got to get into this mindset of software just continually keeps moving and upgrading, and they need to, stay on that kind of fairly leading edge of that. They can't afford to sort of just sit on a frozen system for a year and then expect to have a non-painless update.
Which they could on-prem.
Exactly, yeah, exactly, and frequently do. I mean, we've still got customers on air with playout systems we installed 12 years ago. Never touched them.
Yeah. I want to shift back to mixing and a little bit of discussion about mixing. And Tom Knowles, I think here you guys have made host-based mixing consoles for a while. You've sort of investigated migrating those into the cloud, and I assume you have sort of science projects with that. But where, what do you see as the barriers to doing the sort of functionality that you feel your clients would require in the cloud?
I mean, it wouldn't.
Where are we with standardization and things like that? We talked about NDI. What's missing?
What's missing? I think the 2 points, and they've been briefly touched on, that kind of idea of scale, that kind of, and in one way, it's almost like remote production that often started very small and that scaled up and people do very large things. Distributed production in a similar fashion. So cloud is kind of a logical next step. So I see scaled up productions running in the cloud as something that's inevitably going to happen. It's probably too early for people to do those like properly now, but that's just an inevitable kind of destination of where we're going. So that's more timing than a barrier, so to speak. And then the kind of interoperable aspect of that, obviously NDI was mentioned, lots of media transport stuff. And again, it's already kind of said that the reality is you're going to have to use media transport for each different specific task. So as a vendor, that kind of, oh no, I want to hold out and just support the standard, that approach kind of just doesn't work. You don't have that option as a vendor in this situation. And I think that probably makes things quite challenging, but it's a good challenge to have. And it's just a shifted mindset. It becomes a kind of constantly evolving thing. You have to support all of these different types. And as I think it was Ian said, it's how you present these at the higher layers, at the kind of application layer. You can kind of hide it and make it all look the same. The nuts and bolts of what's going on underneath are the kind of, that's where the choice has to be.
Do you, when you talk about sort of large format stuff, then just let's come back to this control surface issue. Do you see having dedicated broadcast specific control surfaces mated with processing instances in the cloud?
I think there'll be situations where that's completely appropriate, in the same way that there'll be situations where much smaller surfaces, kind of fader panels and that kind of thing is appropriate. That if you're doing a large production, if that's where we end up with huge large productions in the cloud, you're going to want a large control surface. That's just the nature of how those productions are mixed. I mean, I think in terms of operation from touchscreens, kind of System T is so heavily touchscreen based, and even today I watch operators use it who start from the point of view of wanting hardware controls, and they just gravitate to the touchscreen so much. So obviously faders on a touchscreen, that's really hard, but controlling EQ, controlling the dynamics, it works really well on touchscreens. It's quite surprising.
Yeah, well, and physical consoles have certainly gone in these directions. We look at newer consoles and they're more and more touchscreen and less knobs other than faders. What about, do we need, in terms of transport, are we missing, I mean, there are various solutions to this, but are we missing a standard that kind of would give us a MADI stream effectively in the cloud? I mean, we've talked about how hard it is even in regular production when you're sort of trying to find audio channels, 16 or 8 at a time, and I've lost that camera, so I don't have this audio channel anymore.
I think it depends what bit of it you're doing. I mean, those contribution feeds that are all cloud to ground from the venue to your cloud thing. I mean, there's certain scenarios where they're all between a stage box and a processing engine, and both of those things might be from the same vendor, and therefore it might be appropriate for that to be a proprietary connection that is just done that way, and that's how everything gets from one place to the other. And there might be advantages in ways to do that, but then how you connect things on the cloud between each other might need a different standard. How you bring things back for your monitor position, there might be another requirement. So I'm not saying there doesn't need to be another standard to do this, but there are lots of options out there today. It's just picking the right one for the right piece of the puzzle, so to speak.
And time alignment becomes critical. I mean, one of the issues we have with MDI is that it doesn't guarantee timing alignment, and we've had issues with different products giving us audio video packets with quite a lot of jitter between them. And so if you're getting a load of NDI audio streams, making sure that they're all temporally aligned obviously is absolutely critical. And so it's all, you know, I mean, we've got technology that can do the alignment, but only if the time data is accurate enough within the stream to enable us to then use that to do the alignment. And that's not the case for a lot of the protocols, because it's never been an issue if you're running on-prem on a network that you've got total control over.
Yeah, and that's not what those transport streams designed to operate on the internet in the cloud were designed for. So, exactly. So maybe there's another piece of it designed to do that, but it's separate from how that works. Yeah.
And kind of part of that also is like, sometimes you kind of think like certain contribution feeds you could probably get away with, like not having to be within a certain tolerance, but like when you kind of then talking about like the kind of architecture of like the bit in the cloud where you're kind of needing for it to all be processed completely accurately, then to keep your phase alignment, that's kind of key. So I guess that's kind of the next things really in terms of kind of trying to see how that might work.
Well, and if you took something like football and where you're taking now 100 microphones or whatever, you're taking a lot of microphones from a contribution truck and you're mixing those at the broadcast center or whatever, your gallery is remote from that, then having those all kind of packaged, time aligned and all packaged together seems like one of the things that long-term you need.
Yeah.
Yep. I was going to mention, to speak up for the standards, of course, this is the reason that AES 67 and SMPTE 211030 embed in every media stream a PTP wall clock reference timestamp, and that's what that's for. And so we're talking about other protocols, but once we get back around to looking at the definitions of some of these standards and what the functionality is, we just have to use it. It's there. It's in the protocols.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. What about AI? What about automation? I don't know, Rob. Hey, Rob, how are you doing? Oldfield.
Gotcha. Hey, everyone. Yeah, I'm doing good.
You guys involved a little bit with leveraging AI in your host-based solutions. I think it's a question for everybody, the console guys here. As we move consoles into the cloud, do AI and automation play a bigger role? And when we talk about sophisticated control surfaces and lots of knobs, maybe what we need is just more automation and more AI. Anybody, Ewan, anybody want to?
Yeah, I think it is an interesting question, isn't it, Rob? Really, and I think the answer is that there are there are times where it's appropriate to maybe use AI or automation, some form of smart algorithms purely on their own. But there are other times where maybe you want to combine that with the manual mix. And the question is how do you achieve that in a way that works? And the challenge we're all facing is how do we get that working stably in the cloud? So, you know, I think there's definitely an opportunity there. You know, the less that the operator can do of the boring stuff. I think that's your position as well, Rob, as well, isn't it? Really, you know, try and take away the mundane stuff and concentrate on the art of what you're doing. You know, if we can do that, I think that's very interesting. Rob?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's also a whole ton of new opportunities that maybe just haven't been thought about yet, with having stuff being done in the cloud, because in the cloud you've obviously got access to like incredible GPU compute power, and so what are the things that you can do with the things being in the cloud that historically you haven't been able to do? So how can we view our microphones as sort of data gatherers as well as being audio capturers? Because we've all deployed sort of like 30 to 40 mics around at a venue. They're all sampling data for us, and that is hugely valuable for audio, but also other parts of the broadcast chain. And so we're interested in looking at kind of what's the information that we can mine from the audio, whether it's like speech to text, whether it's figuring out where the events are happening on the field, or looking at the moment in terms of like crowd analytics and like which parts, you know, your crowd is often the best metric of excitement. And so looking at what are the exciting points of the game, and can we feed that into other parts of the chain to kind of do automated highlight production and things like that. So for me, it's kind of how can the cloud help audio add value to other parts of the signal chain, as well as being, obviously we've got like auto mixing and auto config of mixes and things like that, but can we elevate audio? Can we become the big brother instead of the younger sibling to video?
Or cousin, as I think we say in English. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you guys have done, Rob, you guys do stuff like ball tracking, for instance, that just gets the ball tracking from listening to where the ball is.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Yeah. So it's, you know, you're doing the AI to pull out what's going on and then triangulating those sources so that you're building up a picture of what's going on the field. And, you know, that can be used to drive all sorts of other stuff, whether it's kind of auto replays or highlight suggestions, or kind of enhancing the mix to make it more cinematic. And then the other thing, which I think we haven't mentioned yet on this call, is like the metaverse that you know, is becoming like a huge topic for everyone worldwide, and is becoming increasingly part of where broadcast is heading. You know, actually looking at how can we do stuff in volumetric. Well, loads of those things are not possible to be done just on the standard, you know, Mac Mini sat next to a mixing console. You know, we need to have something pretty heavyweight to be able to crunch all that data, put together, you know, volumetric audio to go with our volumetric video, so that people can have new experiences of navigating around and customizing.
So if we're watching the game in VR, then we need an 3D audio model that will follow what our VR is doing.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You can't have spatial video without spatial audio. It just is, it's a nonsense. And if you've ever experienced like loads of VR demos which have just got mono audio, it's just absolutely horrific. But when you get a decent, you know, binaural sound going with it, it just sounds epic, and you just buy into it straight away. So I think there's some exciting stuff that's happening in that space, and I'm hoping that I'm not hoping, I know that the cloud is going to be the key to leveraging that and make sure that we can produce great experiences for viewers.
Yeah, well, that's great. Harry, how do you feel about AI and automation? How do you, as somebody kind of close to pushing the faders around, do you see this as a
Yeah, absolutely.
A threat or an opportunity? Yeah.
Sorry?
Is it a threat or an opportunity? No, it's always the joke, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely got its applications. Last year we played around with having one of our desks automated by the director, And I think through the last kind of like half the production, we just took over the faders because it sounded better. So so there's definitely room for growth. But I think it's very exciting to get automation involved. Like I said earlier, with you know, if you're using if you're using software in the cloud, you can really push the boundaries with automation within the cloud. You know, just get loads of pieces of software all talking to each other. So yeah, I think it's very exciting.
Well, I mean, this has been it's been such an interesting discussion, and it's just great to see all you guys and chat with you. It feels like when we started talking about this at the beginning of the pandemic, that this was just really pie in the sky. And just talking to you guys today, it seems clear that there is a path that we're moving along, and that the solutions are coming thick and fast, and they're scaling up in terms of both breadth and depth. And it doesn't feel like there's a line between the traditional way we're doing things and the way we can do things in the cloud, that there isn't a barrier to doing anything. But audio solutions still have some development to go. So I think that's it for me. Heather?
That was fantastic. Really, really good discussion all the way through. That's what I like about the audio community. You know, you come in, you hang into the bitter end, and just we could stay here. If we had beers, we could stay here much longer.
There you go.
hopefully later this year.
It's still early over here, and in California it's really early. So
it's always 5 o'clock somewhere.
Yeah.
We will be the excuse. Yeah.
Don't really need an excuse. But I think you know, welcome to the metaverse, and binaural sound might be a topic for discussion at some point this year. Definitely.
Yeah, well, and I think that, you know, the issue, and we touched on it and really didn't have any time, but the other issue is Atmos and surround. Is when we talk about scalability in the cloud, it ought to make it easier to do 5.1 or 5.1.4. And I think we just need to get the thinking past that we don't have to rewire jack bays or things like that, that we can make things wider if they need to be wider. And it seems to me that moving to the cloud ought to be something that facilitates multi-channel audio, not stops it. So it's an interesting subject for further discussion. So
yeah, it is.
All right. Thank you all, everybody from your various time zones. It's great to see you all. And thank you, Heather, for organizing all this.
That's okay. And join us again March the 9th. We are talking about immersive audio, looking back at Beijing. So put that in your diary. The registration will open tomorrow. So
okay, great.
Great.
All right. Thank you, guys.